of New York, along with the Astors, the Roosevelts. Now, of course, Roosevelt was her maiden name as well as her married name. She was born one of the Roosevelts, and then she married her fifth cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So the Roosevelts are very wealthy, aristocratic, and so she had this very privileged background, yet her childhood was very lonely, very sad, almost Dickensian in some ways, not poor in finances, but she did not have good self-esteem in her early years. So let's get down to it. We're going to hear all about her. Her first name really wasn't Eleanor, it was Anna. She was named after her mother. Her mother was a great beauty, Anna Hall, famous beauty, and her sisters were famous beauties. Her mother was such a famous, wealthy beauty that when she would dine out at restaurants, people would gather outside on the street to see her come out. She was that beautiful. Eleanor was born rather plain with these buck teeth, and her mother let her know right away that she was a disappointment in that she wasn't a male, she wasn't a boy, and also she was not good looking. And as a matter of fact, Eleanor, in one of her autobiographies, said her mother told her, when you're a young lady, you need two things. You need good looks and you need good manners. So you really need to work on your manners. ... The implication was clear. So she was born Anna Eleanor in New York City on October the 11th. Her father was Elliot Roosevelt, the younger brother of Theodore Roosevelt, and who would become president. So she was the niece of one president and then the wife of another. And her father, Elliot, she was very close to her father, who did give her some semblance of self-esteem. He was a very doting, loving father, but he himself suffered, we think, of low self-esteem. His brother Theodore was very dashing and personable and charming and charismatic, and Elliot wasn't and always felt lesser than his older brother. And her father, Elliot, developed alcoholism. And we'll be talking a little bit more about that. An experience when she was only 2.5 years old, it says a lot about her, and I think influenced her life. When she was 2.5 years old, her wealthy family went on an ocean cruise. They were going to do the Atlantic crossing and go spend some time in Europe. And this was the SS Britannic, a sister ship of the Titanic that would flounder later. But anyway, it was a foggy day, and they hit another steamer. And Eleanor said one of her first memories was of this day, that it was fog, you couldn't see, adults were running around screaming, and somehow they loaded her parents on the lifeboats without her. I imagine she was probably with a nursemaid or a nanny, one of the lower classes, so she didn't get in the lifeboat because she was with this nursemaid. Anyway, they realized her father was kind of, throw my child down to me, my little girl. They literally threw her overboard off of this ship, this ocean liner, into her father's waiting arms, who did catch her. So this is partly why she had this loving relationship. Father caught her, but she developed this fear, and she admitted this, of the ocean, of big open spaces, of heights. She had all these fears, but she did not let this keep her down. She traveled extensively. She flew a lot. There's a documentary I saw once where they show her in a crane in this big, high area over a dam. And that must have been terrifying to her, but she did it. She got in this crane. She inspected the dam from this great height. She did not let her fears keep her from doing things. She pushed through her fears, and she would do this all her life. Okay, so she was shy and serious, and her mother called her Granny. And she talked about one experience. Her mother was entertaining female guest, and Eleanor was shyly standing outside the door, and her mother said, well, come in, Granny, and then told her guest, I call her Granny because she's so old-fashioned and serious looking. And of course, that wasn't very much of a compliment. But her father, when he was around, he would throw her up in the air and catch her, and they played games, and he was very loving and doting. But he was gone a lot. Well, he was gone like Theodore. He was into big game hunting, polo, all those masculine kinds of things. But he would be gone for long periods. Where's Papa? Well, he's having another rest cure, and they never really told her. She learned later that he had this drinking problem. And back then, of course, alcoholism, now we know is a disease and has to be treated with compassion. And we have steps you can take. But back then, that was a shameful stigma. Oh, you have to hide it, especially if you're of a good family. So he would disappear for periods. He would be in a sanitarium drying out. And he was given this great sense that he was a disgrace and a shame to the family. But he would write her letters that she would prize and treasure all of her life. She was very widely traveled all of her life, doing great good works, and she would always carry these letters with her all of her life. So one of the letters he wrote, well, a couple of different letters, he wrote that he was going to show her the Taj Mahal someday, that to him, this monument to love was the most magnificent place, and he was going to take her to the Taj Mahal. They never got to do that together. She didn't learn to read until she was 7, and she actually learned to speak French before she learned to speak English. How could this be? Well, she was pretty much raised by the French nursemaid that she had, who spoke in her native tongue, and that's how children learn to speak, as they imitate by what they hear. And so when she was like 5 and 6, a lot of the family, this child doesn't know how to speak English. And so she had to catch up. So when she was 8, her mother died of tuberculosis, and she had 2 younger brothers. Oh, and this was another sad thing. She had these younger brothers, 4 and 5 years younger than she, and mother would sit with her arms around these boys and read to them. Sit very close and snuggled up. Mother never snuggled with her or read to her, but did these younger brothers. And she sat in a chair apart and watched, wishing she had had that kind of intimacy. She learned to be of service right away. Her mother would have sick headaches, migraines. Eleanor, rub my temples. And Eleanor did, and this pleased mother. This is one of her few connections and contacts with mother. So she was being of service, rubbing mama's temples. Another way that she learned to be of service, the wealthy, aristocracy of the United States, there's this kind of tradition of noblesse oblige, that you helped those less fortunate. You would do a little service work every now and then or give to charities. Well, her father really believed in this. So at Thanksgiving, she wrote that one of her very early remembrances, his father got her up early on a Thanksgiving. They went to Hell's Kitchen, to this boarding house in New York, for poor little newsboys, the newsies, who were a lot of orphans, who stayed in this little lodging house, or a lot of them were orphans. And one of the few hot meals they would get, provided by the rich, was Thanksgiving dinner. And so Eleanor helped out, doling out mashed potatoes and gravy, and she was so touched by the gratitude and appreciation of these little boys. Thank you, miss. Thank you. Later, with her family, Thanksgiving at the mansion, with all the crystal and the silver and the linens and the fresh flowers, she couldn't help but remember those little faces who were just so grateful for a hot plate. And that, to her, was really Thanksgiving. So it was from her father she got this sense of helping the poor and disenfranchised. So her mother died, she's 8, and her father was considered too unstable. His older brother, Theodore, and her maternal grandmother signed legal papers committing him as unfit. So he was declared as an unfit father, so she went to live at her grandmother's house, her maternal grandmother. But father kept writing and saying, we'll be together someday, you and your brothers. Well, then one of her brothers died. He also died of diphtheria. And then, so she, within about a 2-year period, her father then They think it was alcohol related. He had a fall and he was killed. So in about a 2-year period, she loses her mother, her father, and a younger brother, all in that period before she's 10 years old. One of her father's letters said, "You must be truthful, loyal, brave, and well-educated." And this became her motto for life. Truthful, brave, loyal, and well-educated. Okay, I'll do that. I'll be that for Daddy. So when she was then 15, her grandmother surprised her one day and said, "Okay, you're going to go to private boarding school in England. And your mother wanted this." So she went to this private finishing school, and she was kind of thrilled to get away from her grandmother, who was very strict, and that the mansion they lived in was very dark and dreary. And she really didn't have much contact with any other children besides her relatives, including her 5th cousin, Franklin. She had played with Franklin a couple times as a child. So she went to Allenswood, this private girls' school, and the headmistress was French, Mademoiselle Souvestre. And Mademoiselle Souvestre was a wonderful teacher, and there were periods of the day where you only spoke in French. Well, now she's the articulate one because she knows French. And other girls are struggling at this, and so she helps them. And just as she's a compassionate, loving, generous person already, other girls see this. A lot of the girls are homesick. She had not really had a stable home, so she's not really that homesick. So she becomes like the big sister to almost all the other pupils. And she's very influenced by Mademoiselle Souvestre. Her grandmother always dressed her in dowdy, very conservative clothes. And Mademoiselle Souvestre said, "Why don't you have nicer clothing? I'll take you shopping and get you some nice, attractive clothes." And Mademoiselle Souvestre was also very well read, very literate. And one of the things they talked about issues and argued these issues. And at this time, the Dreyfus case was going on, this Jewish man that had been railroaded for spying when he hadn't in France. And so they talked about that. And Mademoiselle Souvestre said, is each and every one of our duties to leave the world a better place than we found it. And Eleanor took this in. As she is living a continent away, for holidays, she can't go home. So Mademoiselle Souvestre took her under her wing and said, "Well, you and I will go sightseeing. We'll go traveling. You make all the arrangements. You figure out what trains to take. You book the hotels. You plan our itinerary." Now, Eleanor was like 15 and 16, but this gave her a great sense of what she can do, that she was capable, she could do these things. And so Mademoiselle Souvestre was a great influence, and she later said her time at this school was their happiest period in her life. She made all these friends, she was no longer the lonely little plain girl, and Mademoiselle Souvestre gave her a real sense of self-esteem. Mademoiselle Souvestre also had given her portrait to Eleanor, and everywhere she traveled, like she always carried father's letters, she always carried that portrait of Mademoiselle Souvestre everywhere she went. So now she's like nearing 18 years of age, and it is her duty to return back to New York, to return to family, because of her class, she is supposed to come out to society and attend all these debutante balls and parties and go calling on people. And this is part of the social structure, that if you're a young woman of privilege, this is just what you do. And you have your own coming out party. She hated the idea of all this, but she had to do it. And she was a wallflower again. She's with all these wealthy people, and she doesn't really feel comfortable. And her 5th cousin, who she hasn't seen for a long time, Franklin, asks her to dance. And they find that they can talk and converse very easily. And he's very impressed that she's as well-read and as well-educated as she is. So again, the noblesse oblige. All the debutantes are supposed to do a little charity work. Her peers are going somewhere for an hour a week, doing a little something. But she finds a settlement house. And a settlement house, Jane Addams created the first one in Chicago, Hull House. And this idea spread where these homes are available and there are services and classes for the poor and largely immigrant people to come and learn English or learn skills. So Eleanor started volunteering at this settlement house, and she taught dance and gymnastics to little girls who were so appreciative. She just loved it. So she kept, I could do another class. And she was going several hours a week instead of one token hour. She went and was passionate about doing this commitment. So she begins dating Franklin, and he would call on her at this settlement house. And one time there was a little girl who got sick, and they said, well, we'll take you to your home. And the girl knew the address. They end up in this slum area, this tenement, which is like a 5th floor walk up, this entire family of like 12 living in one room. And Franklin is appalled and shocked. He had grown up not really helping or doing any charitable work. He grew up in kind of an aristocratic cocoon, kind of in a bubble, and he had no idea people live this way. And Eleanor is unflinching. And it's like, well, dear, I hope you get better, and gave them some money for the girl's medicine. And she's used to this. She's seeing these tenements in places. He's like, how do people live? I had no idea any humans live this way. And she said, well, Franklin, a lot of those newsboys have no home at all. They sleep huddled up together in alleyways. They sleep on grates for heat in the winter. They cover themselves with newspapers they couldn't sell. So these people are fortunate. They have a roof over their head. But oh my God, they have no water. They have to go outside to a privy. Oh my God. So she opened his eyes and ears and his consciousness, and he was so impressed that here's this girl of my own class, of my own age, slightly younger, who knows about these things and is committed to helping them and is doing things. So this was the beginning of their courtship. Now, Franklin's father had died when he was relatively young. He had not been around people of his own age till when he was 14. He went to private school. And he was very, very close to his mother, Sarah. And Sarah, by all accounts, was a domineering shrew. And so when he became very interested and committed to Eleanor and they're dating seriously, she tried to do everything she could to break them up. So she sent Franklin on a European tour, but he kept writing letters to Eleanor. She actually then tried to break up the relationship. She's like, you are not going to keep seeing her. Goes, well, guess what? As a matter of fact, I've proposed and she's accepted. We are engaged. No, you're not. Yes, I am. Don't think of it as you're losing a son, you're gaining a daughter. And he was the only child. That's why she had her hooks in. So she continued to try to break up this relationship, but he was adamant. We have to be grateful for Franklin for that. So they did get married on March 17th of St. Patrick's Day in New York, and she is fatherless. So her uncle Theodore, who is now the president of the United States, gives her away at the wedding. Well, you can imagine the reception. Were the guests congregating around the bridal couple? No, everybody's wanting to shake hands and talk to the president who's there at the reception. So they kind of felt left out at their own wedding. So they had a happy honeymoon. Of course, she started having children. Now, Sarah, the meddlesome mother-in-law, my gift to you, my children, is I bought us a townhouse. I'll be living on the other side. Well, she had the townhouse redone, so there were connecting doors to every room. And she totally takes over the housekeeping. I know you are a motherless child, Eleanor. You don't know anything about running a household or ordering servants around. I'll take care of this for you, and I'll help you raise the children. So her influence was felt. One of the great quotes by Eleanor is, no one can make you feel inferior without your consent. And we think this comes from this experience. She did allow herself to be dominated, and overly influenced by this mother-in-law who kind of ran things. So one story I want to give, and Franklin was, he liked to play good cop to her bad cop in their child rearing. Later, she did not have close relationships with her children. And almost all the biographers say they were kind of jealous. She was out there helping other people, helping poor people, being very busy, when most mothers, their whole focus were their children or their homes. And she was not that kind of mother. But partly, this was because Franklin set this up when they were young children. One time, and this is Franklin Jr. who told the story, he had committed an infraction, and Eleanor spanked him and said, naughty boy, and wait till your father comes home. He's going to have a serious talking with you. So Franklin, FDR, came home. They went to his office, and Franklin said, okay, now, buddy, we're just going to have a nice little chat. And a little bit, I'll clap my hands, you let out a yell, and then go out of the room, rubbing your eyes, and Mama will be happy that I punished you. But, I understand, you're a boy, it's okay. So he kind of set this good cop, bad cop thing up. And one time they were Christmas shopping, and one of the other boys had left a bicycle outside several times. And Eleanor says, if that gets stolen or gets ruined by the weather, you're not getting another one. You need to learn to be responsible. Well, he didn't take care of it. It did get stolen. So they're Christmas shopping. Well, I need a new bike. And no, we're Christmas shopping. This is about buying gifts for other people. And the mother-in-law was like, well, what color would you want for your bike? No. They get home after a day's shopping. There's a brand new shiny bicycle in the vestibule of their townhouse. And Mother Sarah just kind of, I got my way. And so she was undermined by both of them in this child rearing. So Franklin had political ambitions from the time he was in college. His distant uncle, Theodore, had become a president. He's got charm, he's got charisma, he's a smart guy. He could maybe become president too. And so he's always very interested in this. He went to law school, got his law degree, and then in 1910 he was elected to his first political post in the New York Senate, which allowed the family to move away from the mother-in-law to Albany. And Eleanor realized, okay, I can run a household. I can run things on my own. I don't need Sarah. Oh, interesting. All the early marriage pictures of Eleanor and Franklin, Sarah is in between them. She's physically dividing them. Well, then he's appointed in 1913 as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. They moved to Washington, D.C. And then in 1917, the country enters World War I. And she wasn't going to be a political wife and be on the sidelines. She wanted to be involved. Now, when she first got married, her mother-in-law said, no more of that charity work. That's not a proper wifely or motherly thing to do. And Eleanor's like, well, it gives me meaning. It fills a part of me. I like doing that, and I want to help other people. So now she's kind of I'm going to do what I want to do. So when World War I is going on, she co-founded the Naval Relief Society and also worked with the Red Cross. And she happened to tour St. Elizabeth's Hospital for wounded soldiers. And they were just lined up in chairs and wheelchairs in the hall with nothing to do. There was no therapeutic recreation. There was nothing, no card games, no books, nothing. And she's like, this is terrible. So she got some of her wealthy good friends, and they raised money, and they had a game room established, and they bought books and made a library and had card games and activities coming in, entertainment. And she said that really gave her, for the first time, a sense of what she could do. And she said, what must be done could be done. When she first started, well, they must know what they're doing. You better not, ruffle feathers. But she's like, no, this needs to be done. So in 1918, Franklin developed pneumonia. He'd been on a trip, so she very kindly, well, I'll unpack your trunk, honey. She had a social secretary of her own named Lucy Mercer. And so she's unpacking Franklin's trunk, and there's all these letters with familiar handwriting addressed to him. That's Lucy's handwriting. She reads one, they're love letters. Franklin, are you having an affair with my social secretary? Yeah. Well, do you want to end our marriage? Do you love her? Well, yes, I do. So she was willing to give him a divorce. She goes, I want you to be happy. If you've been unfaithful, I don't want to stay married to you. So they stayed married largely because of his mother, Sarah. Roosevelts do not get divorces. And if you think you're going to have a political career being divorced and having this affair, it's going to get out. And by the way, Franklin, I'm your mother. I will disinherit you. You won't get a penny from me if you divorce Eleanor. And Eleanor's like, if he wants a divorce, I'm going to grant it to him. And she's like, no, you're not. There's not going to be a divorce in this family. So that's kind of the history there. And that was a big transition in Eleanor's life. This infidelity, she felt, I'm going to start doing what I think is right. There have been things, okay, he's the husband, he's the man of the house. He thinks I shouldn't do this, or I shouldn't say that, or I shouldn't do my charity work. Well, guess what? I'm going to start doing what I think is right. So she decided, well, okay, she would stick with him, and they would have this marriage. We think all intimacy at this point ended, though. And it really became more of a political, business-like marriage. They both, I think, really still loved each other on one level, but all intimacy was over. Okay, 1920, he ran as vice president on a ticket with James M. Cox. They lost the election, and one of the few elections he ever lost in his life. They moved back to New York, and she joined the National League of Women Voters. That next year, a new crisis. They're vacationing in Campobello Island, and he is stricken with paralysis. Now, it's been in many books that still says he developed polio. The recent research, they conjecture that his illness might have actually been Guillain-Barré syndrome, which has a lot of the symptoms, very similar symptoms than polio. However, you all know, Franklin made an amazing comeback. He was able to walk and stand. If he had really had polio, they don't think he would have had such a great recovery. They think it's this other syndrome that he probably had. Now, Eleanor had already said, okay, I'm going to, for appearance sake, I'm going to be a loving, doting wife, and had decided that before this crisis. And she was, by all accounts, she nursed him, she stayed by his side, she encouraged him, and the attending physicians even commended her for her bravery and dedication. Now, when this happened, the mother-in-law, Sarah, Franklin's mother, said, Franklin, don't worry your head about politics. Politics is over for you for life. We're going to go back to Hyde Park. You're going to have a comfortable life. You can read. You can maybe write. But forget about a public life. And Eleanor said, you are trying to kill him. He loved the public life. He loves politics. We are going to keep up his hopes and let him think that he can return to public life. And she openly defied Sarah for the first time, said, no, that is wrong. That will kill him if you would keep telling him, it's over, it's over. He thrives on politics. We need to allow him to believe that. And he worked really, really hard. He would climb up the stairs, crawl all over the house to develop his upper muscles and all that. He worked very hard toward his recovery. So she became active with the Women's Trade Union League. She also worked with the Women's Division of the Democratic Committee, became an editor of the Women's Democratic News, And then she built Stone Cottage in Hyde Park, New York, and then opened the Valkill Furniture factory next to it. This was this was an idea for poor people to learn skills and develop their own industry. The factory would later fail, but she loved the Stone Cottage of Valkill, and that would be her favorite home. It's now the Eleanor Roosevelt Historic Home. She also taught at the Todd Hunter School for Girls, and everybody that had her as a student said she was an amazing, loving, passionate teacher. She was just great, that you would think that was her whole life. She was that good of an educator. But she always had many other things going on. So in 1928, Franklin had his comeback. Now, he had a political friend and advisor named Louis Howe. And one of the reasons Franklin was so successful and was able to have this comeback is Louis Howe said, Eleanor, you need to be out there doing public appearances, doing speeches, staying very involved, keep the Roosevelt name alive. Now, she was a shy woman and, had this kind of awkward look. And her voice at this time was very high and quavering, partly because of her nerves. And he coached her to do speeches, and he would stand in the back. And if her voice got high and quavering, he would lower your voice, lower your voice. She eventually became a very good public speaker. But anyways, because of Louis Howe and Eleanor, his name was kept alive, and Franklin became elected as the governor of New York. She had to resign her political post, but insisted, I'm going to still teach at the Todd Hunter School. And she became, because of Franklin's disabilities, she became his legs, his eyes, and ears. They tried to keep a very low profile on his disabilities. His sons, would support him. It would just look very chummy. They got their arm. He would be walking to a podium, and isn't that nice? He's walking to the podium with his son, but they were there to help him walk. So she then was going into jails and schools and institutions and factories inspecting. And they said she was an amazing, excellent inspector. She wouldn't just go around, look at the kitchen, it looks clean. No, she would look in the pots and pans. She would taste the food. This isn't very savory. This is really bland. Can't you do something here? And she would report back. And she was a great inspector. So in 1929, there was a stock market crash. We're in the Depression. Hoover is in office. And Hoover, if you probably know about the Depression, there were Hoover flags. What were Hoover flags? That was when people would turn their pockets inside out. They had no money. That was called a Hoover flag. Hoover was criticized. He didn't do anything. He said, prosperity is just around the corner. We just need to be patient. And he didn't really start any social programs that really address the Depression. People would sleep under newspapers, people that had lost their homes, and those were called Hoover blankets, newspapers, keeping yourself warm. So Franklin won the election, and she did a lot to campaign. And one of the things that really affected the election was, I think it was in 1930, well, during World War I, the Army was promised after World War I, in early 1940s, you're going to get a bonus. We can't pay it to you now, but by 1940, those of you still living will get a bonus for your service during World War I. So you can look forward to that. So in 1930, we have the Depression. These people are homeless. Some of them were injured during the war, have disabilities, and they marched on Washington. They said, we need that money now. Not 10 years from now, but we need it now. We're the veterans. We won the First World War. And this was controversial. And there were newsreels. Well, what did Hoover do? He sent out tanks and tear gas, and they made their little shanty quarters and little ragged tents and things, and there were newsreels of these tanks coming in on our veterans and tear gas driving them out of the city. So people thought this was outrageous. This is how we're treating our veterans. This is what Hoover is doing. And they just wanted to talk to Hoover. So this was one of the things that helped Franklin get elected. Immediately after the election, Franklin couldn't go himself, but Eleanor drove. She wasn't chauffeured. She drove her own car herself. The bonus army, they were called the bonus army. They came back. There's a new president now. They came back to Washington, were there again, and she came herself. She went around and shook hands and talked to everybody. She said, we can't make any promises. We don't really have the money, but we will help you. We're creating programs that you'll get jobs, or we'll make sure that you're fed. We'll take care of your families. We will do things. We can't just give you that money right now. So newspaper headlines immediately after the election, Hoover sent tanks. Roosevelt sends his wife. Already, she's helping color his election. There's a story too when they're elected. Mrs. Hoover said, okay, you're the new first lady. I'll send the presidential car to meet you at your hotel, and then I'll show you around the White House. And Eleanor said, oh, my hotel's just a few blocks away. I'll walk. You don't walk. You're the first lady now. You don't. Yeah, I'll walk. I'm fine walking. She did. And Mrs. Hoover is showing her around the White House. Oh, this is the elevator operator. Oh, yeah, show me how that works so I won't have to bother you all the time. No, that's his job. But I want to know how it works so I can use it myself. Very different. So she began holding weekly press conferences for women reporters. This was a very savvy thing. She wanted to raise up women in careers, and a lot of newspapers wouldn't allow women reporters. Well, now everybody's going to want to know what Mrs. Roosevelt's doing, the First Lady. So she said, I will only talk to women reporters. So every newspaper that wanted to have what's going on with Eleanor had to have a woman reporter. A lot of women were hired into journalistic fields because of Eleanor. And she began going on fact-finding trips and making appearances for FDR. And she loved to travel by train. She said cars, went through the nicer areas of cities and towns. Trains usually went through the poorer areas. And she said you can tell a lot by people's clotheslines. What's going on in the country, the ragged clothes, the patches. So she loved that, and she was just very aware. 1933 to 35, she worked as an advocate for this Arthurdale resettlement community in West Virginia. This was kind of like that factory where they created this town with different kind of job opportunities to get people a foot up, and it eventually failed, but it was a very noble idea. And then already way back in the early 1930s, when segregation is still very strong, she was already speaking out for equal rights for African Americans. She also helped create the National Youth Administration. There were people writing her saying, I'm a kid, I'm 16 years old, I've got a lot of energy, and there's nothing, I want to help out with this depression. What can I do? And she's like, well, we need to create a group for these kids. They want to help out. So she helped create that. And she also began writing her newspaper column, My Day. Do y'all remember that? My Day? And I have a collection of her My Day columns. And look at this. This appeared 6 days a week for the next 27 years. This was one of the records. Will Rogers also had a long-running column. She never missed a deadline. She always got this out. With everything else she was doing, she always had this column going out. So in 36, Franklin's very popular. He's reelected for his second term. She continues working for political and social reform. And I love this story. She attended the Southern Conference for Human Welfare in Alabama, a southern state, and she creates a stir when she defies segregationist laws and sits beside her friend Mary McLeod Bethune, famous black woman educator from Florida. And they were great friends. They communicated a lot. They had met several times. And so there's this big meeting, and she sits down by her friend. All these people rush to her. You're breaking the law, Mrs. Roosevelt. That we have segregation here in the South. You can't sit there. You have to sit on the white side. She's like, how ridiculous. No, Mary's my friend. I'm going to sit by her. You're breaking the law. You can't do it. So she came up with her own solution. She said, Mary, sit on the aisle. And she got a folding chair, and she sat in the aisle so she could still sit by Mary. And what a statement she was making. That simple little, I'll show you. So she still sat by her friend, but didn't break the law. All right, 1939, she famously resigned from the DAR over their refusal to allow Marian Anderson, this great black opera singer, to sing in Constitution Hall. It had already been set up, and the DAR, Daughters of American Revolution, somehow controlled Constitution Hall, who got to perform there and who didn't. And Eleanor is a member of the DAR. And they somehow didn't realize that Marian Anderson was black. When they found this out, no, we can't have a Negro, a Negress perform. So they were going to cancel her. They did cancel her performance. So Eleanor thought this was outrageous, wrote about it, not only in her My Day column, but editorials saying, when you're a part of a group and the group makes a decision, you feel like this is totally against everything I believe, you have to ask, okay, do I stay with the group and try to sway them maybe later? Or do you say, I can't belong to this group? In this particular instance, I find I cannot belong to this group. It's making a choice I'm totally against. So she not only famously resigned, then she got the workings done behind the scenes so that Marian Anderson could perform at the Lincoln Memorial on Easter Sunday of that year. And 75,000 people appeared at this free concert. And she was a big part of getting this to happen. Now, she could have attended, but she chose not to. Why do you think she chose not to attend? What's that? Exactly right. She didn't want to detract from Marian Anderson or the crowds. So there were all these newsreels, and this was the era of newsreels, no television yet. So people saw these newsreels of Marian Anderson, this huge crowd, and African Americans said that was one of the proudest moments for them, that this great figure of their own culture is there singing, and there's this great crowd, and about everybody in the multitude were African Americans. She purposely would have liked to have been there, but she knew the cameras would be training on her too, and she was happy to do this from the background. 1940, Franklin's elected to his unprecedented third term. We are now, everybody realizes we're on the verge of war, getting into this world war. We're also still feeling the effects of the Depression. People ask me this, now George Washington set a precedent and stated, I think presidents should only have 2 terms. Franklin and the Democrats said, well, we're in this period where there's a lot of conflict, a lot of chaos still going on. We think the reign should still be held by the same person. And the country pretty much agreed. So, of course, the Republicans did not like this at all, and they later would make a law where you could only serve 2 terms. That kind of backfired on them because Eisenhower was very popular. He probably would have been elected a 3rd term, but they kind of shot themselves in the foot there. So 1941, then we are made to get into the war with the Pearl Harbor attack. U.S. enters World War II. And Eleanor, one of the first things that happened with World War II was all the Japanese Americans were gathered up and interred in these camps. And they weren't as bad as concentration camps, they weren't executed, but they were very primitive, terrible places. She was the only public person to say, this is wrong, this is wrong. And she wrote editorials, she made speeches about it. People said, your own husband enacted this is not good. She goes, I'm sorry, I cannot be quiet about this. And she visited these places and said, I'm going to try to do something, because I know you're not traitors just because you're of Japanese descent. So 1941, she went to England on a goodwill tour. She argued with FDR over the camps. And she also visited, and this is amazing, 400,000 servicemen in the South Pacific. And she took only 3 Red Cross uniforms. She took no other clothes. She took several pairs of shoes. And she went from camp to island to military hospitals and burn units and visited these men. And there are films of this, of her leaning over bed, shaking hands, always with this big radiant smile. She worked so hard. She was doing like 14, 16-hour days, and she lost 30 pounds and wore out 3 pairs of shoes doing all this. Now, Admiral Halsey, who was like in command of the whole Pacific fleet, was against her coming, saying, we don't need her distraction, and said she did more for morale for the men of the Pacific fighting. She was a godsend. She did great work, and he couldn't stop commending her. So that was a wonderful thing. And one little story I want to tell about that, the military was still segregated here. Black men are willing to serve and risk their lives, but they're still in separate quarters at this point yet. And there was a colored canteen for the black men. The white canteen was very nice, lots of tables and chairs, very clean. The colored canteen is basically a shack with broken down chairs and only a couple of tables. And Eleanor went in. And the person with her guide was like, oh no, you don't want to go in there. She goes, yes, I do. And a black man had just gotten an ice cream cone. And she goes, oh, that's so good. Can I get a lick? And she licked it and gave it back to him. See, nothing bad happened, did it? He said that did more for him than anything else in the war. Here, the president's own wife, makes the statement, just licking an ice cream cone that he had already licked and giving it back, saying we're all human here. Isn't it silly to think otherwise? She also took down all these servicemen's names. Do you have a message for your family? We understand about the mail being so slow. And she got these messages delivered. So she was incredible. So Franklin, 44, was elected to his 4th term. And then that April, 3 weeks before Germany's surrender, he died in Warm Springs, Georgia, which is where he did a lot of his therapy when he was making his recovery. Now, it's sad enough that happened, but on the way, on the funeral train, one of Eleanor's relatives said, well, you should know that he wasn't alone in Warm Springs, that by his side was Lucy Mercer, her old social secretary, that he had had the affair with all those years before, and she was by Franklin's side. Well, how long had that been going on? Well, for quite a while, your daughter Anna arranged the meetings. So her oldest child, her only daughter, well, poor Pa, poor father, he's sick, he's looking terrible, he's got all this pressure on his shoulders. Why shouldn't he have female companionship at his side? And so this double betrayal, not only of your husband, but of your daughter. So that August, Japanese surrendered, war ended. December, President Truman appointed Eleanor U.S. delegate to United Nations. She thought she would just retire, go back to her home in Valkill and just be quiet and enjoy her grandchildren and try to be more there for her children. But then Truman said, and she and Franklin worked on the idea for the United Nations. He said, you're the perfect person. You're so diplomatic. You should be our delegate for the United Nations. And she couldn't turn it down. She said, yeah, I want to make sure that this United Nations is successful. So 46 to 48, they said her work on the United Nations, especially in these first premier years, was incredible. She worked 16-hour days every day. And every waking hour, she was constantly thinking. And she was a great diplomat. Now, okay, we got this person who's wavering. We can maybe pull them to our side. We know they're good friends with so-and-so. So we'll have so-and-so to dinner with us and say, can't you persuade that person? And she was just very good at these little machinations. So she was appointed chairwoman of the Human Rights Commission and was instrumental in drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And she said this was her proudest achievement of all the things she ever did. A universal declaration saying all people are human, all people deserve quality of life, equal rights, things like this. And this was argued about, every letter, every comma, everything, and she stuck with it. Okay. Also in this period, the late 40s, she spoke out, was one of the few political people, famous people to speak out very quickly, right from the get, against McCarthy and the witch hunt, the Red Scare hearings, the McCarthy hearings. She was like, you know, people, if they went to one meeting about communism, their careers shouldn't be ruined because of that. So in 1952, she traveled to India, Pakistan, Middle East as a diplomat. She campaigned for Adlai Stevenson's unsuccessful bid for president. And then Eisenhower was elected in 52, and then when he took power, she had resigned her position with the UN. However, she continued working as an educational volunteer. And she said that she couldn't just say, okay, I'm no longer with the UN. She said she had to be involved somehow. And it isn't enough to talk about peace, one must believe in it. And it's not enough to believe in it, you have to work at it. You can't just say, well, I believe in this. No, you gotta work at it. So we're gonna see a film clip now. And this is the elderly Eleanor going into the late 50s, early 60s. She was still very controversial. She was always controversial. A lot of people didn't like her. They thought she was a bucktooth old busybody and not proper presidential wife. She should, you know, just be hosting gatherings at the White House and know her place. But she never was like that. She always had to be active and involved. So long after Franklin's death yet, she's being very outspoken for civil rights. You're going to see in this clip, she even was doing TV commercials. Her children, between the 5 of them that survived, one died in childhood, the 5 of them, they had almost 20 marriages between them, 19 marriages. They never had successful careers. They always had financial problems. So she would do TV commercials to help them financially. But we're going to see an example of one. It's her margarine. But she found a way to make a message out of it. She said, are you aware of world hunger? That some people don't get enough to eat. Oh, by the way, you know, there's this margarine. She was always so busy doing good works, she didn't know who Frank Sinatra was, but then appeared on a Frank Sinatra TV special. And one thing, this always amazes people, she had a $25,000 bounty on her head by the KKK because she was always outspoken for racial civil rights and did things about it. So you're going to see in this clip, she went to the Highlander Folk School where they taught civil disobedience, where Rosa Parks learned about, well, if they tried to take away my seat and I was there first, I'm in the colored section, I'm not going to move, you know. So she was making an appearance there, and the Klan had put a $25,000 bounty on her head. But she still went. She was never cowed. She did what she felt was right. Take a second to wake up.
We are now trying to win to the free world, the uncommitted peoples of the world, in Asia, in Africa, and in South America. And most of those people are colored peoples.
Even in her 70s, Eleanor still sparked controversy.
And the suggestion that we do not consider our own citizens as equals makes them feel there is something really radically wrong in everything that we offer them. So they'll take a good look at what the communists offer.
Well, what can we do about this? It's a big question.
Face it, and realize that we can't afford to have 2 kinds of citizens. We must have equal citizenship for anybody in our country.
Conservative newspapers, disturbed by her ever more outspoken support of civil rights, dropped her My Day column. Protesters picketed her appearances. Threats were made on her life. In 1958, the Ku Klux Klan learned she was going to speak at a civil rights workshop at the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee.
The day before she's supposed to go, the FBI contacts her and says, Mrs. Roosevelt, we can't guarantee your safety. The Klan's put a $25,000 bounty on your head. We can't protect you. You can't go. Eleanor says, I didn't ask for your protection. I appreciate the warning. I have a commitment. I'm going.
She was relentless. She made a statement to the effect that if you don't take a stand, you've got to leave the impression that you're cowardly. She used the word cowardly.
So Eleanor flies into the Nashville airport, and she's met by this 71-year-old white woman. No Secret Service, no cops, no young muscle men around her. You know, this elderly white woman picks up a 74-year-old Eleanor Roosevelt. And here they are, they're gonna stand down the Klan. They get in their car, they put a loaded pistol on the front seat between them. And they drive up at night through the mountains to this tiny labor school to conduct a workshop on how to break the law, how to conduct nonviolent civil disobedience. And she drove through the Klan to do it.
She was tough as nails. She had made herself tough. She was just as tough as FDR, just as tough as Theodore Roosevelt.
She didn't stop because this woman evidently was convinced that she was doing the American thing. She was thinking about the future of her country.
Most Americans never knew of the threats on Eleanor's life.
And I thank you, Mr. Sullivan, for giving us this opportunity.
I thank you, Mr. Roosevelt.
By the late 1950s, she seemed to be everywhere.
Give to the American Cancer Society. A real campaign is being put on by the Soviet Union.
In politics, in print, on television and radio.
I wonder if you realize that more than 2/3 of the people in the world are underfed.
Eleanor used the programs to promote issues she felt were important and to make money to help her children.
Years ago, most people never dreamed of eating margarine. But times have changed. Nowadays, you can get a margarine like the new Good Luck, which really tastes delicious. That's what I've spread on my toast. Good Luck. I thoroughly enjoy it.
Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt.
To all the maidens and damsels, to the Fräulein and Mamsels.
I went down for lunch one day, and Maureen Corr, his secretary, said, Mrs. Roosevelt, it's a call from California. It's Frank Sinatra. And Mrs. Roosevelt said, find out who he is, dear, and what he wants. It was an invitation to appear at a special.
There is a Gallup poll taken every year to select the 10 most admired women in the world. This year, for the 11th consecutive time, the name at the top of that list is that of a lady whose friendship I treasure very much. Ladies and gentlemen, the most admired woman of our time, Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt. Now then, if you had 1 minute to leave one word with, say, 25 million people, what would that word be?
That one word would be hope. Oh, next time you're found with your chin on the ground, there's a lot to be learned. So look around. Once there was a silly old owl.
Now you're going to see Val kill her prized home, her retreat.
In the last years of her
historical
life,
place.
Eleanor enjoyed more than ever the time she could spend at Val Kill. Her house was always filled with people, grandchildren, close friends, former New Dealers, visiting dignitaries, and neighbors. She seemed a better mother to her grandchildren than she had been to her own.
I wasn't beautiful, I wasn't social, and my parents really weren't sure what to do with me. So my grandmother became my substitute parents, and I spent a lot of time with her because I felt welcome at her house, and she was wonderful to be around.
In those years, she enjoyed life very much. She enjoyed parties, giving them. She was a wonderful hostess. She enjoyed good food. In the summer, her cook made the most marvelous frozen daiquiris, which she enjoyed. She was great fun. She laughed with real gusto.
We saw a lighter, happier, even though she was older, happier person, a little more relaxed, and very sure of herself in a gentle way.
More than half a century after her father's death, Eleanor made the journey he had promised they would take one day. To the Taj Mahal, the monument to eternal love. She stayed through the evening, sitting alone in the moonlight. As long as I shall live, I shall carry in my mind the beauty of the Taj. At last I know why my father always said it was the one thing he wanted us to see together.
Okay, isn't that sweet? She finally got to see the Taj Mahal all those years later. So she, just like that one historian says, she just never quit. She just had this boundless energy. So in the last years of her life, she traveled around the world, tirelessly worked as a fundraiser for UNICEF, cancer research, many other charities. She campaigned again for Stevenson and then Kennedy's campaigns, and then joined the board of the directors for the NAACP and CORE. That's what is that? Something racial equality. Congress of Racial Equality, thank you, yes.